Well, this was a friend of mine who swears to me that it's true. When the same-sex marriage law was passed by both houses of Parliament in Britain, it eventually went up to Buckingham Palace. And the Queen was in the room with the Privy Councillor who had come for her to sign it, and there were a couple of other laws she had to pass. And she said, well, who'd have thought 60 years ago? And there was this slight pause, and I thought, oh my God, what's she going to say?
Now, did you come to regret the denunciation earlier this year of an utterly evil, capricious, mean-minded and stupid God?
No, not in the least, because you see, I don't believe in God. This was the basic premise on which the question that an Irish journalist asked me. He said, well, if you're wrong, Mr. Fry, if you're wrong, and there is a God, what would you say to him? So the whole thing is a sort of premise on a premise. It's a supposition. It's a hypothetical, as they say in America.
It was, of course, but he did also say, if you meet him at the pearly gates.
That's what I mean.
We are talking about a Christian God.
If you meet someone that you don't believe exists, what would you say? Well, I would say, how dare you?
For those who didn't see it, tell us how you came to conceive of an evil God, a mean-minded God.
I didn't come to conceive of one. I'm talking about the universe as I see it.
Yes.
I'm just saying, if there is a loving God, how come children get bone cancer? Answer me that. It's that simple. It's not a game. I'm not trying to be funny. It's just, how can you begin to say there is a loving God and give children bone cancer? So they howl and scream in agony and die. Or because I want them in heaven. That's a ridiculous nonsense. That can't be true. It just can't be true. So there is a lot of thinking to be done. And I'm not undermining the thinking that serious theologians do and the branch of scholarship that they embark on to try and justify pain and evil in the world. And so I made the mistake in the modern world, if you like, of saying what I thought. And one of the biggest errors that you can commit in our times is to be honest if asked a question. I was honest.
More on that in a minute, because honesty can get you into trouble across a range of things.
Especially, oddly enough, it gets you into trouble with moral, religious people.
Well, it did on Twitter, didn't it? There was a viral explosion on Twitter.
Oh, it was mostly favourable by a huge amount. It was favourable because I think that's an obvious question. It's the simplest question we all ask about religion. There's the obvious prime one, which is what's actually known as the prime mover argument in religion, which is if there's a universe, who made it? There must be a first cause. And then any child can say, well, then if it's God, who made God? And so on. These are simple questions, but they're beautiful. Like all the best questions in intellectual life, and physics and other things, they're very, very simple. And an extremely simple one, if you're told God loves you and loves the world and loves everybody, is why does he cause such appalling, or allow such appalling pain? And there were 6th century BC philosophers who said if God doesn't allow it, then he isn't all-powerful. If it just happens without his permission, then he's not all-powerful.
I'll come to the problem of pain, as it's called in a moment.
C.S. Lewis
wrote about this quite a bit, but the Christian backlash earlier this year, although it was outweighed by non-believers, got so bad that the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, in an interview had to weigh in on your favour.
Yes, because he's a decent, well, the thing is, he's a thinking man. He's a very intelligent man. And I think if there were a God, one of the things he would want us all to do as much as possible is for us to use this extraordinary instrument he's given man more than any other creature, and that is his ability to reason. His reason deductively, inductively, and to try and understand and embrace the real complexities of reality. What he would not want us to do is to abandon our intelligence and just shout and scream and hiss and throw petrol bombs, or the verbal equivalent of petrol bombs, on Twitter. Stephen Jay Gould, the zoologist, paleontologist, proposed, I think partly because he was from quite a religious background, he proposed a sort of ceasefire in the war between reason and religion. And it's called nom, which is a word people use to describe delicious food. But it stands for non-overlapping magisteria. And he takes it, there are these two magisteria, magisterium being just a fancy word for a realm, a domain. So the two domains or realms or magisteria are science and religion. And his proposal was that science should deal with all the things science could deal with, and anything it couldn't, then religion could, and religion could deal with all the stuff that religion could, and anything it couldn't, could give to science, and then both sides would respectfully wave at each other across the chasm. This is difficult because obviously science makes discoveries that are empirically testable and reproducible, which fly in the face of any such ideas as transmigrations of souls or of any ideas of literal interpretations of the Bible.
Did you see Russell Brand's video, by the way?
Yes, I did, yeah.
So he makes a similar point, I guess, to Gould in a sense. He's saying there are certain things that science can't explain. But if you actually decide to believe in science, you have to accept the one big miracle that happened at the beginning, which is the Big Bang. There's no question about what happened before it.
But that's exactly my point. What happened before God then? It's exactly the same argument. It's meaningless. It's only basic logic collapses that point of Russell straight away. Yes, listen, there's this rather feeble thing that people say is science doesn't know everything, and the assumption therefore is that you can then proceed as if what you've said is science knows nothing. All right, there isn't a scientist alive who claims that science knows everything. Any scientist would be incredibly disappointed if they felt that the end of science had come and that the last sum had been done and that the last apprehension about the universe had been made. I mean, look at the Large Hadron Collider. They're all terribly excited at the possibility that the Higgs boson field won't be discovered, won't be proven. And then the Standard Model will have to be totally rewritten, and that'll be something thrilling for scientists. If you want to hear something that a scientist usually says, it's "I don't know," because that's basically the tool of science is to take your ignorance and to try and find out. It's that simple. The pleasure of finding things out, as Richard Feynman called it. Now, as humans, we don't spend our time, unless we are scientists 24 hours a day, just finding things out. We live, we love, we make mistakes, we wonder why this happens to us in a metaphysical, emotional, moral, social, sexual way. We have all kinds of worries and fears and disturbing thoughts about life in the universe, and science can't even begin to cover them, and no scientist would claim that it does. But that doesn't mean that Genesis is true. That doesn't mean that Sunni Muslims are right to blow up Shiite Muslims. It doesn't mean that that Hindus are right to blow up Muslims in India. None of that follows from the basis that science doesn't know everything. Science doesn't know everything, therefore I'm going to ram my religion down your throat and tell these women what to wear in public and whether or not they can go to school. How does that make sense?
Let's go back to the more cerebral side of the argument that emerged earlier this year, and it did go back to C.S. Lewis and the problem of pain, and the question arose, would you prefer to live in a world where an all-powerful God intervened in everything to stop pain and stop suffering? Because the C.S. Lewis argument is that if there is a God, it wouldn't be an all-powerful God that intervened at every moment, otherwise we'd have no free will. Yes,
that's the old argument, absolutely. The free will is usually given as... but then let's conceive of a possibility that there is a God before a universe was created who had the ability to build any kind of universe he wanted. So it wouldn't... pain or non-pain wouldn't be an issue. You might as well say, well, there's another universe that exists in which there's this thing called blim, which makes your eyes boil. And God has decided that you should have blim and your eyes boil, but if you pray, it will go away. Well, why? Why would you make blim? Why would you make pain? It's not as if God not making pain, there's a universe without pain, man sits there saying, this God hasn't even given us pain, so we have the option of not having it. Because we wouldn't know what pain was. Why would we conceive of it? The Greeks quite rightly posited the idea of a golden age. And they had a much better apprehension of why the universe is the way it is, why the world the way it is that there was a golden age, but our Christ, the Greek Christ, was the Titan Prometheus, who loved man so much he wanted to give man divine spark. So he took fire from heaven, from Hephaestus' forge, and he gave it to man. And Zeus was so furious, he took Prometheus, chained him to the Caucasus Mountains, and because Prometheus was an immortal, a Titan, he had his liver torn out every single day, was restored the next day, torn out, because he died, he suffered for man. And that was the Greeks' idea, that essentially if there is a God, somehow they're angry that we've been given an equality to them. We've been given their divine fire.
This year's controversy wasn't the first time you had a run-in with the religious, if we could say this. I mean, a couple of years ago you found yourself having to write a blog saying, "I am not an Islamophobe." Tell us why you wrote that.
I wrote it because I was afraid, so I wasn't an Islamophobe. It's that simple, if I'm honest, isn't it? But it depends what you mean by phobe. Phobos is fear in Greek. So yeah, I'm afraid of, not all, of course I'm not afraid of all Islamic people, but I'm a Christianophobe. I'm afraid of all kinds of people, not automatically, but I'm afraid of a certain kind of fundamentalist, violent, intolerance, ignorance. I'm afraid of it.
Well, the kind of intolerance, you would say, and you wrote another blog about this, that would cause a fanatic to murder a cartoonist in Paris.
Or a blogger in Bangladesh. It's recently happened. Secular blogger. And yeah, I'm afraid of those things. Who wouldn't be? But of course, I have no quarrel, and I would hate to see an increase of any kind of intolerance or bigotry towards people going about their lives following their own devotional careers and aims. I mean, you know, the piety and belief of other people is not my business. I'm not here to persuade people not to believe in God. I'm absolutely not. I happen not to, and sometimes I'm asked to justify it, as if it's an extraordinary thing not to believe in God, so I do, and sometimes I do so passionately. But what I absolutely will not do is tell anybody to believe me. It's not, why should they? They can listen to me if they want. But if they want to believe in their God, they want to kneel at their altar and bow in the direction of their God, then they should have absolutely every right to. The only thing I have a quarrel with is if some elements of that institutional religion or personal, you know, people have taken that religion to the extent of performing violence and burning gay people and any of the other horrors that are taking place around the world.
Last week on this program we convened a dialogue between the atheist Sam Harris and the reformed Islamist Majid Nawaz. They both made the same point, that the intellectual left has suppressed open debate about Islam. It seems that you came to the same conclusion.
Yes, I don't like what's happened to the left. I don't like the fact that the left has become, it's become sort of so judgmental and so closed to reason and to, in a sense, to liberal values. And if I belong to any tradition, it is to that started by perhaps Bertrand Russell, that of a sort of liberal, secular, doubting. Bertrand Russell was way ahead of anybody else in terms of rights for women and so on. But he was culturally conservative in the sense that he believed in the value of education and reason, open reason that is not questioned. And I sometimes wonder that some of the left are not becoming clerical in their attitudes.
Let's move on, a complete change of topics, because you and fellow comedian Elliot Spencer got married this year, so we can be sure that we're now in the 21st century, but so surprisingly is the Queen.
Oh, yes, you heard about this. Well, this was a friend of mine who swears to me that it's true. He is extremely friendly with a chap who's an equerry, as the official word is, like a courtier figure who works at Buckingham Palace. And this can't still be true of Australian legislation, but it is true of British legislation, that if an act is to be finally passed into law, it must get what is known as the royal assent. In other words, she must sign a document that makes it law. And so when the same-sex marriage law was passed by both houses of Parliament in Britain, the Commons and Lords, it eventually went up to, in 2014, summer of 2014, I think it was, to Buckingham Palace. And the Queen was in the room with the Privy Councillor who'd come for her to sign it, and there were a couple of other laws she had to pass. And she said, well, who'd have thought 60 years ago, and there was this slight pause, and I thought, oh my God, what's she going to say? That such a bill could come to pass. Isn't it wonderful? She was extremely
the Rainbow Queen.
Yeah, yes. It's nice.
Very surprising.
Well, she's an aristocrat. she's met lots of fruity, peculiar people in her life, many of whom have been family friends. Although, it must be said, her grandfather was an absolute monster, George V. There was a very famous scandal amongst them, a chap called Lord Beauchamp, who was a very, very senior member of the House of Lords, the Liberal leader in the House of Lords, which mattered then. And he'd been having his way with various chauffeurs and footmen and things, and it all got a bit too hot for him to handle. His cousin, the Duke of Westminster, who hated him, hounded him, and he ran for France so he wouldn't get arrested and have an Oscar Wilde situation. And someone told King George V about Beauchamp, and he said, "Really? I thought men like that shot themselves." A terrible phrase.
I don't mean to laugh.
No, it's hard not to.
But
You're laughing at the sort of extraordinary English attitude.
Can I just say that there wasn't a kind of universal joy in the gay community, such as it is, at the news of your marriage. There are still some who say, we fought for liberation to overthrow antiquated, oppressive institutions like marriage, and now we're begging to join in. What do you say to them?
I understand that. Well, firstly, I'd say, of course, that there is not a single gay person in a relationship who's forced to marry. Yeah. It's never going to happen any more than it does to straight people. And when I was young, there was this, my mother used to use the phrase because she'd read it in a magazine somewhere of the sort of hippie generation, people shacking up with each other, she used to talk about. And if you wanted to express a sort of anti-bourgeois, hippie-ish view as men and women would live together without marrying. And it was kind of, wow. But slowly that either happens or it doesn't now. I know plenty of straight couples who live together and haven't married, and plenty who've married, and it'll be the same with gay people. But I understand that the campaign for homosexual equality, as it was originally called, and then gay liberation and various other names, it took on a lot of the trappings of a political campaign that involved a very distinctive anti-bourgeois, anti-patriarchal sort of attitude, along with feminism and various other things, and ban the bomb, and a whole sort of, there was a great sort of a raft of issues that you could feel all somehow were opposed to the status quo and to the establishment. And the fact that gay people have revealed themselves to be, some of them, like myself, to be shamelessly bourgeois and happily united in the 80s. I apologise to those who thought that I've sold out, but I'm afraid I never really bought in.
So has it changed your life in any respect, or in most respects?
Not in any, I mean, it has in a legal respect that I can't put my finger on exactly, but I suppose it's something to do with wills and, you know, predeceasing and all the other upsetting things. But in terms of just emotionally, so yes, it does. It's a wonderful feeling. It's hard to explain. I've had relationships with people before that have lasted a time and felt that I've been with that person, but there's something very special about, well, there's something very special about Eliot, and there's something very special about the act of union being recognised by the state. It's silly, and yet it has a definite feel to it.
For someone who's written and spoken extensively about deeply personal things, from mental illness to your cocaine addiction, one of the things, perhaps I'm wrong in this, but one of the things I think you haven't spoken a lot about is sex.
Yeah.
Are you shy to talk about it?
No, good heavens, I bore you and disgust you horrifically with the talk about sex. But my first big talk about sex was an article I wrote, which I did talk about, I think, in one of my autobiographies. It was an article I wrote for Tatler magazine. A fellow called Jonathan Meads, a very fine writer himself, was an assistant editor. And he called me up. I was about 24 or something, I was a couple of years out of university. And he said, we're running a series of articles under the heading I don't ... And I've got, this art critic says why he never goes on holiday, this novelist says why he'll never have pets, this one's why he doesn't drive. Is there anything you don't do? Because that's what it's about. And I thought for a bit and I said, well, I don't do sex, does that count?
17 years.
I could hear his drool hitting the carpet. Yes, please, write that up. You know. So I wrote an article.
Is that true? 17 years
yeah,
celibate?
That's right, yeah. Again, I invoked an unpleasant God. I said, what kind of God, in creating human beings, would then invite them to find delight in organs of the body that are parked exactly adjacent to, or indeed share a function with, the organs of excretion. He said it's like a Gestapo colonel taking his prisoner and throwing his lunch in a cesspit, saying, "Go and eat, there's your lunch." And it's so unkind. And frankly, all those damp, tufted areas of the human body with those strange odours, how can anybody find them attractive? And I wrote about that at some length.
What flicked the switch, though? Because obviously you came to know damp, tufted areas of bodies.
And you seem to have suggested a lyric here. Love flicked the switch. Love lifted the switch. Yeah, I think it was actually a number of things, one of which is the mental health issue that you alluded to. It had a rather big eruption in the mid-90s, and it was after the dust had settled from this particular episode, and during which I got properly diagnosed as having bipolar disorder, that I realized that all my life I had sort of tried to control my feelings and things, and that I'd imagined everything should go into work, and I worked at an astonishing rate. And then I just thought, well, I'll find, and I found someone. It just happened, and that's what allowed sex to take place. But I'm certainly during the period in which British politicians who were very that now people would say homophobic, but I'd say at the very least not gay friendly. Was one, I remember one parliamentarian who was always going on about what you do know what men do to each other, don't you? And the bits and pieces they put inside and around and next to each other. And it's disgusting. I mean, that's not right. And so I was asked to do a talk at Parliament in Westminster Hall when a particular MP was bringing in an age of equality legislation. And I said, I've just done some search on this thing called the Google, because Google had just happened. And I said, and I looked up anal sex. And the first 7,000 references were to men having anal sex with women. Now, it may be that I'm not saying that it's 1 in 7,000 acts of anal sex are gay or straight, but let's imagine it's 70% all acts of anal sex taking place in the world at any one time are between a man and a woman. So if that's your objection, then you must be objecting to heterosexual.
We're going to have to bring this to a conclusion at some point fairly soon.
That's what we always say in bed, isn't it?
Yes, I guess it probably is, Stephen, as a matter of fact.
You want me to talk about sex? We must bring it to a conclusion, is what we say.
Yeah, absolutely. The whole cocaine thing, I'd just briefly like to touch on that because you've given a long list of palaces, the House of Lords, the House of Commons, Buckingham Palace, where you did cocaine. It's an extensive list, but I'm actually wondering more broadly whether that's the thing that kept you going through this incredibly productive period where you seem to be on television every 5 minutes.
Well, it is. I wouldn't recommend it, and I regret it. I really do regret it. But I'm very conscious of having to sound like someone who is a kind of sorrowing, apologetic figure, saying what a fool he's been, which is a sort of boring thing to be, and on the other hand, suggesting that there's anything good to be had from these narcotics, which I don't believe. So what I do say, just to bring it back to mental health, because it does matter to me, this, is I know it sounds like an excuse to say, well, I had bipolar disorder, so I took cocaine and I drank a lot. But just imagine for a moment that you do have a condition in which your moods can change without your ability to change them back in big ways. You become hugely manic, or you become terribly depressed. And you don't know that you've got a disease. You just feel either ridiculously energized or you feel appallingly low and suicidal. There are two things you can reach for in our world when you're not, diagnosed, and they are uppers and downers. They're alcohol and they are cocaine, speed, whatever it might be. Things that you can control your mood with. So this, what's known as self-medication that people go through, is an attempt to try and control the weather in their own mind because they haven't yet been told that actually it's a disease, and we may have some drugs that can help you that are legal and probably slightly less dangerous and less expensive. But so you become dependent, or I became dependent on basically just taking these mixtures of drugs and keeping an even keel. But of course, it's a false control, because each down when you is a bigger crash, and that results in a bigger up, funny enough, a bigger mania as well. But it did mean I took but I never took coke when I was working. I mean, I wouldn't do it on stage or in a television studio or anything like that. It was always, I used to call it rather creepily pudding. It was the thing to have, you know, what you would call a sticky, I guess, at the end of a meal. But I'm so glad it's over. It was a ridiculous situation to be in, and I've seen it doing terrible harm to people.
Let me finally come to one of the mainstays of Australian television, or the ABC, for a very long time has been the QI program. You are leaving it.
Yeah.
Much to the regret, I imagine, of legions of fans. You're going to be replaced by a very funny woman,
yes.
As it turns out. But it must be like the end of a marriage or something like that.
It is. It was a wrench to say goodbye, but I'd done 13 out of what will be at least 26, because they're each keyed to a letter in the alphabet, and having got to M, I thought, well, if I'm going to stop, best stop now. And I'm absolutely thrilled that Sandy Toxic's taking over, because I think she'll be superb.
Well, it has been a bit of an issue with QI, hasn't it? Gender.
Yes, in some people's eyes. It's a very difficult one, because Caitlin Moran, who's a superb writer and journalist, whom we've asked many times, but she said, you know, publicly when writing an article about this issue, she said, I can't think of a single woman of self-respect who would accept going on such a programme, because it's so obvious they would be on as a token woman. So if you've got that problem, and I can see why she would say that. If I were her, I wouldn't go on saying, oh, they want a woman on, do they? And maybe that's, you know, this is the problem, is we start, you know, balkanising the entire thing. It's so difficult, and if people are counting ethnicities and gender, then it's all, frankly, just such a bore, and the easiest thing is to walk away. And
you are walking away, and I have to ask one final question, is the obvious one: what next?
Well, I have just done this year a documentary series in Central America, and I think I'm putting to bed documentaries as well for a while, and concentrating a bit on some performing. And I've written a series for TV that I'm going to be in, so I can tell you no more about it because it's in delicate negotiations.
You'd have to kill me.
Yes, I would have to kill you, and that would be a shame.
It'd be a bad way to go at the end of an interview. Stephen Fry, we thank you very much. It's wonderful to speak to you again, and next time, hopefully, we'll find out more about your project.
And about God.